Good evening and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Marcia Franklin. Why are Bill Gates and Oprah Winfrey the richest man and women in the United States? At first glance, they have little in common. Different economic backgrounds, different ethnicities. One lives in the Midwest, the other in the West. One's a computer geek, the other an entertainment diva. Well, my guest tonight would have an answer, just as he's able to tell us why so many people want to live in places like Boise. He is Richard Florida, a professor of regional economic development at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh. The author of 6 books and more than 75 articles, Dr. Florida has served as an advisor to the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, as well as numerous state and local governments whose leaders want to know how to attract the best and the brightest. His latest book, so new it's still in proof copy, is entitled The Rise of the Creative Class. In it, Dr. Florida lays out his thesis that we're in the midst of a dramatic change in our social structure, and many of the people driving that change may not even realize it. Dr. Florida is in Boise as part of a lecture series sponsored by the Foothills School of Arts and Sciences, which has graciously shared his time with us so that you can hear more about his work. One note, because tonight's program is taped, there will be no phone calls. Well, welcome to you. You've been in Boise, I think this is maybe your second visit in just a year or so.
Yeah, it's my second visit in about a year.
You must like it.
Yeah, it's been great. And every time I'm here, I have more fun. So that's good.
Great. Well, going back to my comment about Oprah Winfrey and Bill Gates, that's I kind of threw that in. But based on what I've read of your work, certainly we can say there's lots of reasons why they're so successful and so wealthy. But one clear reason must be that they're both very creative, and this is something that you study.
Well, yeah. The book is about the rise of this group I call the creative class. 38 million of us out of a workforce of about 125 million. We're 35% of all the entire workforce. We're bigger than the working class is or ever was. And what we have in common is that we use our creativity to create new ideas, to create new products, to entertain people. And mainly, all of us are creating economic wealth no longer by using our backs and our brawn and our physical strength, but by using our ideas and our creativity. And it's an amazing thought, when you think about it. I grew up in a working class family. My dad worked in a factory. I spent most of my youth working in a factory. Who would have guessed that between the time of about 1975 and the year 2000, we'd double the size of this class and we'd become the economic value setters and the norm setters for our country and the world.
How do you define this class? Because as I said, both Bill Gates, who works in the arena of computers, and Oprah Winfrey, who's clearly creative in the entertainment field, you would consider both creatives, but you've expanded the definition even further.
Well, we spent a lot of time on the definition, and it wasn't something that came to us overnight. We began to look at where new ideas were coming from and where high-tech industries and fast-growing industries were coming from. And as we began to look at it, myself and a team of terrific statistical researchers at Carnegie Mellon University and elsewhere, we began to say, no, it's not just the people in high-tech industries, and it's not just the people who work in the legal field or the financial field that support them. There are people in the arts and cultural field, in entertainment, in design, in architecture, in high-end professions, in healthcare, who are all adding value through their creativity. And then the next step we took was started to look at cities and regions that were growing. And we found some fascinating statistical facts, which actually startled us. We began to look at the relationship between culturally creative people. We called it the Bohemian Index, and high-tech growth and innovation. And lo and behold, it had a higher rate of correlation than all the traditional measures, whether that be research and development or the level of human capital or education or universities. It seemed to us that these bohemians, these culturally creative people, were linked to economic growth. And then I came to a really simple conclusion, that creativity is not just one thing. There's technological creativity like Bill Gates. There's artistic and cultural creativity like Oprah Winfrey. And there's economic creativity, which comes by starting new enterprises. The place that we're growing didn't have any one. They had all three.
So how does this affect what we might call economic geography? I mean, typically we hear about Sun Belt versus Rust Belt, bicoastal. These creative centers that you're talking about don't necessarily correlate to traditional geographic economic centers.
Well, we have a new economic geography, and it's really changing very rapidly because we're experiencing really one of the greatest migrations in modern history. Of course, one element of that migration has been the rise of a whole new group of people, new immigrants, greatest rate of immigration in U.S. history. But the part that we don't talk about is the migration of this creative class. In the past, in my father's time, when I was young, people live in mixed communities by income, by social status. There were factory workers, perhaps in a separate town, and there were professionals, and there were people who worked in service industries. Now we're seeing this creative class, which has choices. We all have choices. We're highly mobile, most highly mobile group in human history. We can pick where we want to live, and we're picking particular places. So we see huge concentrations, in part on the West Coast, with San Francisco and San Diego, in part on the East Coast with New York and Boston and Washington, D.C., but we're also seeing strange things, like 3 of the top 10 cities on my creativity index are in Texas. Austin, of course, which is number 2, but also Houston and Dallas. Minneapolis scores through the roof. Chicago, where Oprah Winfrey works, is also ranked very highly. So there's no particular geographic pattern. The other thing is while creative people do show a bias to big cities, if you look at my top 10 list, 9 of the 10 are city regions over 1 million people. Small places are competing and winning.
And that's why I mentioned it in the top of the program that Boise, Idaho, and Huntsville, Alabama actually have something in common, because they rank 4 and 5 amongst cities of our size for this creativity index.
Oh yeah, I mean it's quite amazing that places like Boise or Madison, Wisconsin, or Santa Fe, or Huntsville or Boulder are extremely competitive. And typically, which Boise competes in to some extent, but not quite as much, they have a really major research university, and they couple that. Smaller cities that are competing very well with something Boise does really well in is a lot of outdoor natural assets, because creative people want stimulation, they want experiences in everything. You know, they want excitement at work, they want challenge. Challenge is the number one thing we want at work. We want flexibility, we want the ability to be ourselves, but we also want excitement and stimulation in our day-to-day lives. And one aspect of that stimulation comes from being outside and enjoying the outdoors. And since we don't work fixed schedules, since we work very flexibly, we want to have easy access to the kind of things we love to do.
What interested you in this research? There's been a lot of research, of course, in why companies choose to locate a certain place and how to attract companies. Perhaps less research in why individual people choose places. Is that what you saw, a gap in the research that you wanted to fill?
Well, let me step back for a minute. I think my interest in this comes from my life. And, you know, I was born a working class kid in Newark, New Jersey. My dad worked in a factory, and he would take me to the factories on Saturdays. And what I saw in that factory and what I learned, he was a guy with only an 8th grade education, and he'd say to me, the people who really make this factory work are these workers who use their ideas and their knowledge. And there's a story I tell in the book about, I was a Cub Scout, like many young boys, and there's something called the Pine Wood Derby. I don't know if you know what it is, but you take a block of wood and you carve a car. Well, the first year of the Pine Wood Derby, I took my block of wood, I slapped some paint and a decal on it, I put the tires on it with the little nails, and the thing just started down the track and it fell apart. And I said, Dad, all these other kids have these great cars, why don't we? So we made a pledge that we'd make a better car next year. And what we did was we went to his factory on Saturdays. And sometimes the other workers would help us, and sometimes they'd let me run the machines. And we made this car that won like 5 Pine Wood Derbies in a row and won the state championships. What was clear is they were highly creative people who had a lot of human creativity. So I think my interest in this stems from when I was really young. What happened is I got to the university. I was studying regional development and what makes places like Silicon Valley or Seattle or Austin, Texas tick. And one day I just woke up and I said, you know, this theory's wrong. The stuff people are looking at aren't what really determines what makes places grow. And then I just began to ask people, why do you choose a place to live and work? And the answers that came back didn't fit any theory. I want a nice place to live. I want to be myself. I want to experience diversity. I want to find challenges. And then I go and find a job. I pick a place, I focus my job search, and then I find where I want to work. And that's something that traditional theory had never thought about. They just thought people chased jobs, you know, and people went where the companies were. What we were finding is that wasn't true.
We'll talk in a moment about the strategies you believe that units of government should use to attract such workers. But going back to your roots and your sense that the factory workers were so creative, what do you say to those people who worked in those traditional industries who are out of work now, who are looking at maybe these creative class people with their SUVs and their you know, fancy clothes and they don't have to work 9 to 5 and they're feeling, hey, wait a minute, I'm left out. And clearly, as you mentioned, there are creative people within that segment too.
Well, I think the real challenge for the United States and for our group of people, the creative class, is to reach out to these other people in the working class that I grew up in, or people in the service class, you know, the 50 million people who wait on us, and say to them, you know, you can be part of this creative economy. I tell stories in the book about people I know and I work with, the woman who cuts my hair, the person who I depend on to kind of manage my house, and how incredibly creative they are. They're not paid as well for their creativity. In every factory, workers have always been creative, but they've been managed in a command and control hierarchical structure, and they don't like it, and nobody likes it. I think the real challenge is, how do we harness the human creativity of all of these people? You know, Mr. Matsushita, the founder of what we now know as Panasonic, said a long time ago, and I've done a lot of research on factories, not just creative environments, said the reason that we will win the manufacturing war in Japan with the United States is because we harness the creativity and knowledge of all of our factory workers. Where you see them as mere hands tending machines, we see them as minds. And he said, you know, 10,000 minds will beat 10 minds any time. And I think that's really the key. The real challenge in our society is we've got it. The creative class works creatively. We have designed the best workplaces. We're far ahead of Japan and Europe in designing creative places, whether they're entertainment or culture or arts or high technology. The big challenge for our society is to move those structures down to allow people in the working and service classes to benefit. The only thing else I'd say, and for folks out there listening in, I often ask my students, where does that music you listen to come from? Where does the art that you really love, where does it really come from? And time again, when we trace it back, we find it comes from really poor communities and what we think of as disadvantaged groups. Well, there's enormous creativity that's going untapped in our society. That's really the challenge. Not just to emphasize the creative class, which we will, and
but emphasizing the creativity within all sectors.
Absolutely, and that's going to lead not only to better economic growth, that's going to lead to a better society. So it's a win-win.
Because clearly we need factories, and we need, you know, the whole economy can't run off of the creative class.
Absolutely, and I think the other thing is that we depend on the service class a lot. I mean, these are the people who are tending our house. You know, we outsource virtually everything we do, so we don't take care of our homes. We don't make our food, right? We go get takeout from the restaurant, or we buy it pre-prepared for us. You know, many of us increasingly don't really even take care of our kids. We have people who help us with that. And I mean, it sounds kind of silly, but those people are not paid very well. You know, there's no reason, economic reason, that a steel worker or an auto worker should make $75,000 or $80,000 or $100,000 a year. They do that because they organized unions and they won the right to bargain and get higher wages in line with their productivity. Real challenge for our society is to pay people for their creative inputs. And I think that's going to be a fundamental challenge, because one thing my research finds is, even though the creative class is leading this charge, even though the creative class is driving our economy, the gaps between the creatives and the others are growing. The average person in the creative class makes double what a member of the working class or the service class make. And if you look by regions, you know, if you look at a San Francisco or a Washington, D.C., and compare them to a Sharon, Pennsylvania, or a Johnstown, or a Youngstown, Ohio, or a Yuma, Arizona, the gap is off the map. So really the challenge is going to be not only how do we focus on the creative class and attract it, but increase the creativity to pay the income of other people.
Let's talk a little bit about how cities can attract the creative class. You talk about the 3 T's. Technology,
talent, and tolerance. And for a city to compete and win in this economic world, even in the midst of a recession, the NASDAQ nosedive, and even in the wake of 9/11, people, in fact, are becoming more selective in where they want to live and work, because they want more out of life. They realize it's not just enough to have a job. So technology, talent, and tolerance. One of the things I've studied is my own hometown, Pittsburgh. We're a technology superstar. We created the Lycos technology that at one time was the search engine of choice in the internet. We spun it out of the university. We created the company. Company moved to Boston. Why? Because the second T was in Boston, talent. So you need to invest not only in creating talent through great schools, not only through retaining your own talent, but making sure you become attractive to people from all over the country and all over the world. But not even doing those first 2 T's is enough. You have to do the 3rd T, which is tolerance, because creative people come in all shapes and sizes, all nationalities and all ethnicities. They come in all age groups, they come in both genders, and they come in all sexual orientations. And creative people want to know that the place they live and the place that they work is open to everyone, because they're going to be judged on their merit and their skills and their talents. So for a city, you have to do all three. The cities that score high on my creativity index, the economic winners, score high on all three measures. Middle of the pack cities score high on 2, end of the pack cities score high on none. But to really put it all together, and you know, you look at a city like my hometown, Pittsburgh, off the map on technology, medium on talent, lower on tolerance, it's a middle of the pack city. But you look at the Miamis of the world, very diverse, very open, large ethnic communities, large gay communities, but no technology, also middle of the pack cities. So you have to do it all if you really want to compete and win.
And you have created these indices, you and your students, the Bohemian Index, a gay index, which might be somewhat controversial, but you've found correlations between what people might think of people living in the margins or disenfranchised people and the level of creativity and therefore economic force in a community.
Yeah, you know, one part of my research, I go out and observe the world and talk to people and do interviews, but another part, you know, and I'm blessed with having these really talented peers and colleagues and students, we do a lot of statistical research. And we try to summarize that in a nice way in the book and not make it too overbearing. But we invented several indices. One is the Bohemian Index, the number of artists and performers and musicians and entertainers in your community. Another is the Gay Index. Beginning in 1990 for the first time, and now in 2000, the census actually asked this question, you could surmise where gay people were. Well, we thought this was a very good measure of how diverse a community and tolerant a community would be, because sometimes the gay community is subject to a lot of discrimination. Well, when Gary Gates, my student who now works at the Urban Institute in Washington, created the index, and I was working on high-tech industries, one day I came back from leave at Harvard. We put the two lists together, and they were the same cities. And Gary and I just looked at one another and said, something's going on here. So we began to delve into the patterns.
So how do you convince, say, a town that's making the transition, that's been kind of down in the heels, maybe conservative, and then you say to them, you know, if you have a more diverse community, and that includes more ethnicities that they may not be familiar with, different sexual preferences, you can raise your economic level. I mean, how do you sell that to people who are already depressed and angry and perhaps fearful of outside influence?
Well, you know, this is a very hard sell, and I think the market is going to sell it. You know, I'm going to go in, I'm going to try to help. I work in communities all over the country, spend time with mayors and community leaders and business leaders and community developers and leaders of ethnic groups, community groups, and gay groups, human rights groups, so all of them. And I try to bring them together, but it's up to that community. If that community says, we want to close the gates, we want to keep out new people, we want to keep out diverse people, we don't like gays, well, and the other fact is, of course, they have gays, because gays are in 99.6% of all American communities. But if they don't want to admit it and they don't want to be open, they're going to die. And that's up to them. If they want their economies to die, that's up to them. But if they want to grow, and if they really want to grow and deliver value and income to their citizens and their residents, they're going to have to become tolerant and diverse places, because the fact of the matter is, you can only grow if you're tolerant and diverse and open.
Let me play a little bit of devil's advocate with you. Boise's growing rapidly. 10,000 people a year, by some estimates, move in. I don't know how many move out, but a large number move in. I have interviewed lots of people who've moved here, many of them to the suburbs surrounding Boise, and they're actually moving here because they want a less diverse and, in their view, more comfortable, their Anglo majority, place to live. They were uncomfortable in places like California, where they felt like they were a minority. So how does that jive with your research? When I meet a lot of people who, in fact, are more comfortable in a less diverse, more suburban, more box store, generic atmosphere?
Well, Boise's done really well, and not only are you growing, I mean, you're 35.2% of your workforce in creative class occupations, which is really high. Anybody over 35% is a winner. And you have 75,000 people in creative occupations, which for your size is truly amazing. You're doing well, and you're also a technology winner. You're off the map in certain technology scores, patenting and high-tech industries. And of course, people do like to live in communities with other people like themselves. Let's take Washington, D.C., for example. Had a conversation with a group of people about 2 months ago. I said, where do you like to live in the country? They said, Washington, D.C. The Korean student said, why? There's a great Korean community, and there's a Korean church, and there's Korean kids for my kids. The Indian student said, there's a great Indian community. The African-American student said, there's a huge African-American middle-class population, and the gay student said, DuPont Circle. I think that what makes a truly great growing region is something for it doesn't mean that people are all living mixed up together necessarily. There may be certain communities for certain types of people by age, by sexual preference, by ethnicity, what have you. What makes a truly great region is it can be open and accepting of all. Boise does lag on certain diversity and tolerance scores. Although you have a gay community, you're in like the 175, 180 range on my gay index. You do better on the Bohemian index, but I think one of the things that your community leadership has to think about is Boise is making it, it's on the map, people know it, people in the high-tech community know Boise's there, and I think the real challenge for your future growth is going to be how do we lower the barriers to entry for all groups? How do we make this a comfortable place for everybody?
Do we necessarily want to grow so much? I know I used to live in the Bay Area. Great place to attract creative people, became wildly expensive. So then a lot of people out-migrate, leave. In addition, I need to say it was so expensive there were hardly any children in my neighborhood, families. And I found that rather lonesome. I like to have children around. And so, you know, you've talked a little bit about the Bridget Jones economy that we're in now, a lot of single people, a lot of creative people paid well, but for other people that they may need to leave, and in fact some creative people need to leave
Well,
too.
the scary thing is that we are getting this segregation by demographic structure, and we are getting the phenomenon of childless cities, whether that's San Francisco or Seattle. And some of those are really terrific cities. I mean, in another part of the book, I talk about the relationship sometimes between child-friendly cities and the gay index, and lo and behold, they're very highly and positively correlated. But I think you're right that something's happening in these creative meccas where it's driving up cost, and actually it's not just driving people out, it's driving creativity out. I mean, the San Francisco thing where the high-tech people, you know, and the yuppies started to drive out the artists and musicians and culturally creative people, that really is jeopardizing and was jeopardizing San Francisco's future. But there's one thing that I'll say is it all comes full circle. Because if creative people move out of Soho, they go to Williamsburg. If they move out of San Francisco, they go to Oakland, or they go to Boise, or they go to Portland. And these creative communities rise up. And you know, I had the opportunity to meet Jane Jacobs, the world's most famous urbanist, one of my idols, who's in her late 80s. And I asked her about the San Francisco thing, and she said, truly the most remarkable thing I have ever heard. I said, aren't you worried about this, Jane? Isn't San Francisco you know, eating its own seed corn? Isn't it going to die with this gentrification? And she said, no, it'll all come back around. She said, do you ever go to these really bad ghettos with blighted housing and abandonment and really falling apart? You ever notice that's where the grand houses were of a previous era? She said, when places become really affluent and they drive out all the creative people, they become really boring. And not even the rich people want to live there anymore, and then they leave and the place declines.
And then they re-gentrify. We're rapidly running out of time, which is unfortunate, so I want to get some more points in. How has 9/11 changed the situation? I know after that event, I took some time to think about what I do and where I am.
Well, 9/11 had a big effect on this book. It had a big effect on its title. Elevating the idea of the rise of the creative class to its title, on the thinking on the book, because we're no longer making decisions just on how we can make the most money. And I talk about front-loading your life to make a whole bunch of money in your 20s and 30s and then, you know, retire and do the things you want. People aren't thinking that way anymore. They're thinking about what really matters to me and my family. So the book is really about how do we cope in a post-9/11 world. The other thing, which we didn't talk about, that I have to do in the next 2 weeks, is I'm writing a paper for New York City on rebuilding Lower Manhattan for the creative age. One of the big issues in Lower Manhattan and in thinking about Lower Manhattan is that was a specialized financial center. And what some of the leadership in New York is thinking about, particularly folks on the regional planning board, is how do we make that rebuilt area a truly creative center which can be open to arts and cultural and economic and financial creativity. Not only that, linking to Soho and the other parts of Williamsburg and Brooklyn. How do we link in Newark and Jersey City and the depressed areas where some companies are starting to move, not only so that there's a flow of traffic and commerce, but those underprivileged communities can benefit from this rebuilding. So it's something right on the top of my mind, and hopefully some of these theories will actually make it into the thinking about rebuilding that site.
We've talked a lot about private industry in this discussion. There's obviously the government sector and public service, and I'm assuming you see a great role and need for creativity in that arena and in public service.
Government doesn't get it. And if you ask me, one of the big challenges of my life in our time is the fact when I was young, most of the creative people I knew wanted to go into government service. Now I talk to my students and young people who are incredibly creative, and where do they want to go? Out of government. Some of them are going to the nonprofit sector, which is picking up some of the slack, but government has to adjust to this creative age. And the other thing is many creative people are just turning their backs and walking away because they think government doesn't get it. So it's our obligation to act on government, but government has to get it and become more creative.
And finally, what is the obligation and role of creative people when they do their own projects? I must say that a lot of so-called creative projects we see are often full of violence and negative images and more entertainment perhaps than creativity. I think you've even remarked that if you look at the terrorists in 9/11, they were awfully creative too. It's not necessarily a force always for good.
No, creativity can be used to various ends, but we have to realize it's the economic force that powers our society. And I think, I say this in the book, and the last chapter is called The Creative Class Grows Up. I mean, this is really the issue of our time. When the working class became a large class, it grew up. It organized its members. It formed unions and made social conditions better, not only for itself, but for everybody. My dad would always say this, even when he went into management. The unions got us the good wages, and the working class people got us the good wages that all of us enjoy. Now it's time for the creative class to grow up and to think not only about how I get a bigger SUV, how I get a house in the mountains where I love to ski, how I get a house on the ocean where I love to sail, a bigger Sub-Zero refrigerator for my kitchen. How do I build the kind of society that I want to hand down to my kids that reflects this creative ethos? And I think that's going to be a big challenge in the next 2 decades. And hopefully, if we put our minds together, we can make this an even better society than it already is. And it's pretty darn good. For all of its faults, if I compare it to the society I grew up in, it's pretty darn good.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. You've been listening to Dr. Richard Florida. He's a professor at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, visiting here in Boise. Thank you for taking the time to talk with us today.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Appreciate it. And as usual, thanks to you for tuning into this edition of Dialogue. We hope you'll tune in again, same time, next week. Good night.